feels good to be home. Hi, my name is Mohammed Khalid, and I'm a McNair Scholar at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, as well as Mellon Undergraduate Research Fellow right here at Hopkins. For the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of working with Coalium International, which is the world's first counter-extremism think tank. In this role, I help the organization in countering extremism of all forms and helping promote respect for values of democratic pluralism. So, part of my work includes making connections in between the past and the present. So, for example, the word humankind. We have to be human as well as kind. But the Muhammad that you see before you was not always this way. I did not always think that way. For instance, when I first came to the United States, I migrated to 2 different countries, which is Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates. Coming here to the US, my first encounter with an American was actually a customs officer. And for some reason that day, maybe because he had a bad day, the customs officer chose to yell at us instead of speaking politely. And that really took its toll upon me, because here I was as a child, expecting generosity and kindness in this land that I had imagined, with schools like Hogwarts and fields like Narnia. So, but just having these kind of hostility leveled upon me personally was something that I did take personally. And from that point on, I kept that in mind. So what happened after that is my father, when we were finally going back home, on the drive back home, my father was still unfazed. He said that this is my country, and this is your country. You're going to live, work, study, and die here. And so my father had clear boundaries, and he had clear lines about our purpose in this country. And I did not disagree with my father. I wholeheartedly agreed with him. In fact, I was very, very excited about starting high school and making connections with my classmates. But unfortunately, from the very beginning, I began to feel lost and isolated, because I found out that my first name, Mohammed, happened to be the nom de guerre for terrorists. It happened like this. On the first day of classes, students would get up and introduce themselves as well as where they were from. Hi, my name is Mohammed, and I came from the United Arab Emirates, I would say. And I would not get any polite smiles or nods, but instead I only heard snickering. Oh, Mohammed? Like the terrorist? So that made me confused. And I asked, well, why are you calling me a terrorist? What have I done wrong? And after class, a few classmates would come up and say, well, you know that being a Muslim automatically makes you a terrorist. So that was something hard for my mind to process, and I became even further confused. Well, what does my religion have to do with terrorism? And by the way, who are these terrorists that you keep on speaking of? So I did what most of us in this room would probably do in search for answers. I went to the internet. My initial searches about Islam and terrorism were just about everyday religious terms. So on Google, I was just typing in basic religious terms. Eventually, my searches became more and more political in nature. And I began to soak in YouTube videos that would portray the US as an enemy responsible for death and destruction around the world. This became my reality. And this became something that I accepted as what was happening outside. So I created a YouTube account. I began reposting and posting these videos that I felt represented what was happening outside, because I felt strongly about it. I began to accrue subscribers, comment on other people's videos. Well, like a fish hooked on a poisonous snail, the online extremists reeled me in. Yes, the whole world was wrong. Yes, I was on the right path. But I need not worry. Now that I was on the side of good, all I had to do was to fight evil. And the face of that unimaginable evil was the United States of America. So my interactions with the online world made me more of a social recluse, that I began to just separate myself and sideline myself from the real world that was outside. Because I thought that the real world was what was happening behind the virtual world. Just being glued before a computer screen, I thought that everything that was happening online was actually representative of what would happen outside. So I began accepting that, as well as getting more deeper in touch with extremists online. I always envisioned, however, that there would be a government agent sitting somewhere, looking at me through the eye of a drone, and watching me in real life, and just shaking their heads in dismay. But if the government was watching me online, which they were, they could also see that I was translating jihadist propaganda on a full-time basis. I would spend more than 40 hours a week translating jihadist videos and suicide bombings. This became my world. And this is something that I just envisioned myself doing so much in the future that I began to imagine, and I began to seclude myself from my very own family. I began to imagine that only I was on the right path, that not only my family, but also the entire world was on the wrong path. And all I had to do was to fight evil. And again, that evil was the United States of America. Well, one day, I was walking back home from high school because I hated being in the same school bus with my classmates. An unmarked car stopped by, and two officers came out of the car and introduced themselves as police officers, even though I thought that they were dressed a little bit too formally to be police officers. And they asked me where I came from and where I was going to. So I said, well, I'm coming from school and I'm going back home. Well, why are you walking home? Because I felt like it. It's nice weather out. And so they said, well, okay. And then they just asked me a few other questions, and they just sent me up my way, telling me to be careful when walking the busy roads. So I walked the rest of the way home, or at least searching for a home, all the while wondering whether the two men were more than police officers. The FBI knocked on my family's apartment door when I was about 15 years old. They told my parents that they were there to help me. What they actually wanted was information from me, a kid. So I told the FBI, I talked to the FBI, and what they wanted was information on the online extremists that I was talking to. They wanted to know their names, their pictures. I would just go over with them on multiple locations and interrogation rooms, telling them whatever they needed to know, but as less as they should have known. Remember, I still saw the FBI as an enemy, as part of the other. I would play the game of politeness and niceties, hoping that they were satisfied with their answers, and when they dropped me back off to my family's apartment, I would just go back online and establish my bona fides with the extremists, telling them that the enemy had been duped. So it was one day after Independence Day, shortly before my 18th birthday, that a postman came in the house in the early hours of the morning. He knocked on the door and told my parents that he needed to see this kid, Mohammed, with his ID. So my parents woke my sleepy self up, and as I shuffled my way to the door and gave my ID to the postman, I noticed how he had a Johns Hopkins Priority Mail envelope in his hand. He looked at the ID and looked back at me and said, yes. As some of you may know, yes is what it says on the acceptance envelope when you finally get accepted to Hopkins. But I'd been accepted to Hopkins many months prior to that, and I was confused. Well, what is this? And I was excited. I was like, well, maybe there's something else for me in there. However, the next thing I knew is that I was slammed against the neighbor's apartment as multiple agents who were hiding under the stairs came streaming in my family's apartment and executing a search warrant. They tore apart the apartment and took away anything and everything remotely related to computers and technology. Needless to say, I was dumbfounded. I was shocked. I could not process what was happening. I was so shocked that it took one kind FBI agent to tell me to say goodbye to my own family. So from that point on, I was taken in an unmarked car And as I was sitting in the car, just looking at the greenery outside, trying to take it all in, I feared that I would have never seen that greenery again. But behind that fear was also in a failure, and a colossal failure, to see the world for what it is, not what it was portrayed as online. I was taken to a prison system in an adult jail in Pennsylvania. And first thing about prison is what I noticed is that it happened to be a very boring place, completely different from what it was glamorized in the online circles, in the extremist groups. And many prison guards and prisoners were curious about what happened to me because a lot of it was under a sealed indictment. So they would pull me out of my prison cell and they would ask me what happened, but I would not tell them. I would just go back like a lizard content with its hole, back to my cell. But they kept on insisting, and eventually, I caved. I told them about my life. Most importantly, they told me about their lives, their dreams, their hopes, and their families. I was still mad at them, so what they chose to do is tell me to read the Quran. And I read the Quran for the first time, something that I had never, ever done. Correctional officers shared their life stories with me. They told me how their families had gone through tragedies. For example, how one correctional officer's parent was actually tragically lost in an accident, and how that trauma kept on living with the correctional officer every day. So I would cry with them, and I would humanize them, something that was denied to me and something that I had denied myself in terms of doing it to other people whom, again, I consider as part of the other. As well as prisoners, too. The prisoners have very, very different and difficult lives. They have very difficult decisions to make. And many of them looked up to me for consolation and support. So whenever I tried to talk a prisoner out of suicide, I tried to imagine what it would happen to my family if I made such decisions. All that the prisoners and the prison officials wanted to do was to understand. And all I ever wanted in my life was to be understood. From that point on, I began to interact with other prisoners as well as other prison staff, and began to advocate on behalf of prisoners and their educational and vocational opportunities that were mostly denied to them. And thankfully, I succeeded in many, many cases, and prisoners were afforded very good education as well as other vocational opportunities, something that kept them busy and out of the difficulties that they found themselves in, just like I did. Just before my sentencing, I found out that I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism. I now knew what had gone wrong in my life, why I was so obsessed with finding the meaning of religion, and why I was not taking the FBI as seriously as I should have. The hardest thing in life is to reestablish your life as well as reestablish your trust, because reestablishing a trust is a process, but it will remain a process if it is never acted upon. I very much love our Muslim community, and I know as a community we face challenges in addressing the problem of radicalization and extremism. But with Muslim communities, as well as non-Muslim communities, the biggest thing that we have to keep in mind about our so-called opponents is that our views and perspectives are actually more similar than we agree on. Everyone, even the worst actors in our lives, have the same very human motivations that drive us to do terrible, terrible things. Once we finally understand that, and once we envision how the other person can be part of us, how the same dots that they're connecting in their lives can be our dots, how the same experience that they kind of go through can be our experience as well, is when we are finally able to move on in our lives by keeping in mind how many hearts that depend upon us, the lives that inspire us and are inspired by us. You don't have to be a former prisoner or an ex-terrorist to know that all of us suffer in the same way. that each one of us is more than the worst thing that we have ever done. When we finally begin to connect the dots with the other people that we other in our lives, is when our lives become more meaningful. Now remember, the two officers that I told you who were in the unmarked car when I was headed home, those two officers were actually FBI agents. It took me quite a while to get the answer to the question that whether they were partaking in some intimidation tactics or whether they were doing their due diligence. And again, it took me quite a while to reach the second level, to understand that maybe the agents were as confused as I was in what to do with me, but they probably did not harbor as much resentment for them as I did for them, as much resentment for me as I did for them. When we finally begin to accept in our lives that we are all part of the same humanity, that the same fabric that weaves our life experiences together, is when we can call those other people as our very own. Thank you.